Railroad engineers, have you encountered anything creepy on tracks? Went by a few movie shoots. Biggest one was the first Transformers movie. The scene where Bumblebee gets caught. A lot of movies are shot in that area by the First Street Bridge in LA. Pretty sure there is a porn studio not far from there too. There is a nudist colony on one run where an old guy would always come out and wave at the trains. Knew we were coming since there were road crossings that we had to whistle for. Got mooned by some guys on a golf course. Not pretty. Nudist colony, an old guy would always come out and wave at the trains. What, precisely, would he wave? I'm a conductor, so I'm the guy that sits directly to the left of the engineer. I haven't been doing it for too long yet, so I probably haven't seen the amount of stuff a qualified engineer has. My first week as a trainee on the job, we came across a dead pony next to the tracks that must have been hit only a few hours earlier. The next morning, going back the other way, we passed by it again, and it looked like what you would expect to see on a Discovery Channel show. Scavengers had gotten to it that night, and it was maybe half a pony at this point. Nature is pretty rad. The death of the Pony Express was a sad but necessary development in the history of both travel and technology. I'm not a train engineer per se, but I've spent lots of years working on the signals of the East Coast. I'd say one of the most interesting things I've seen are the villages of people that really pop up in the right spots. Tons of people, dogs, homeless villages with friendly people who aren't afraid or embarrassed ever at all. Also, in some mountain towns of West Virginia, there are some unique folks with tracks running through their properties. Up in the coal mines of Wyoming, they have what rail crews call the Golden Arches. It's just a yellow painted framework that has speakers on it that the empty coal trains pass through. A warning is played on repeat saying in Spanish and English, "Danger! Get out! This car is about to be loaded." Loaded coal cars get dumped at power plant pits where huge augers break it up. I guess more than a few poor souls have been augured up accidentally after being covered up with coal. Hey, I'm an engineer on a Class 1 on the West Coast. 9+ years of seniority, with 7 being as an engineer. Have never seen anything creepy or mysterious though, but have hit plenty of unfortunate animals, and trespassing incidents are as sky high as ever. Also, train riders may be decent sometimes, but a lot of them are criminals and some are very dangerous. Every so often a story pops up where some suburban kid decides to ride the rails and ends up dead. It's not a safe environment for anyone. So, nothing ghostly or mysterious to report, but please make sure you stay well clear of the tracks. We do not like hitting people, we don't sign UO to watch people die, and a lot of coke workers have a degree of PTSD afterwards. I'm not a train engineer, but one time in grade school we were on a school trip and a railroad ran parallel to the road our bus was on. Our school bus ended up going the same speed and direction as a train, and the conductors opened their window and yelled slurs at us. 4th grade was fun. Yeah, this is pretty unrelated to what OP is asking, but it's one of the most relevant things in this thread so far. Not a railroad engineer, but the last time I went on a train, it was from Seattle to California. On the second night, we suddenly stopped and were waiting for a while. Apparently there had been a naked woman running along the train track and laid down and let the train go over her. I looked out the window after we stopped and heard the news. Well, sure enough, she was outside, looking right at me. I was 10 and I was scared as fuck. My brother-in-law oversees the maintenance of all kinds of trains. I asked him this very question a while ago. He said that all sorts of weird shit ends up on the front of trains. Most notably, he once had to remove a human head embedded in the front. Where the rest of the body is, we'll probably never know. I thought I found a dead baby under a bridge. I was stopped waiting for my signal and I noticed a bundle of clothes and what looked like the body of a small child underneath the bridge. My heart was pounding like crazy as I approached it. Turned out it was a doll, some used needles, and some discarded clothes. I was relieved. Conductor for CSX here. Weirdest was we almost hit a cow or bull. It's nighttime and we're going along and a stretch of woods comes up and we turn off our lights to see the signal better, and there is a big black spot on the rails up ahead. You can see light off the rails for a long time, and it is starting to shift a bit, so engineer hits the lights and shit you not was a massive black cow bull walking across the rails. It was weird. I've seen tons of deer, coyote and other small Ohio animals. We didn't hit it but pretty close. Sorry for format spelling, I am on my phone. My uncle's best friend was a conductor engineer for a train years ago. He told me that one night he was going up through North Florida and saw some deer on the tracks, so he lays on the horn to scare them off. All but one ran off the tracks, the last one ran in front of the train, along the tracks. He had to try to slow the train slightly to keep from running the deer over, but couldn't. The train caught up with the deer and he lost sight of it, believing he had just run it over. When he got to the next city and slowed down for a turn, he noticed something on the side of the engine. He leaned out to see the deer laying on a set of steps just out of the view from his seat. It ended up jumping off in the middle of the city, a few hundred miles from its home. Finally, a question in my area. Now to think of something weird. I've got nothing. In my short career of 6 years working in Australia, the only thing that amounts to anything remotely funny was when I hit an emu in the outback. It's not strange to hit a few kangaroos or goats, but this day an emu stepped in front and it exploded into feathers. I mean, they went everywhere. Around the door frames and stuck in the windscreen wipers. It's hard to put into words, but thinking back, it had to be their moment. Not an engineer, but I work on the production gangs. Last year one of my operators calls me saying he's not going to be doing his maintenance because it was too sketchy. I go over and check it out, and there were a bunch of needles and empty Mickeys on the ground around where his machine was parked. Where we park our gang in London, is a pretty rough part of town, and he was directly under a road bridge. My boss told me when he was growing up he lived near a mannequin factory and he would pull the defects out of the trash cans at night and put them on the railroad tracks. He said after a week or two the trains didn't even slow down anymore. This would have had to have been in the 60s. Well, I'm not in the railroad industry, but my buddy is a conductor, and while he was driving, conducting, his trainer girl ran out of a chapel in her wedding dress right onto the tracks, and well, you know the ending. He was in therapy for quite a while. Well, my grandfather used to work on the railroad as an engineer. He always tells me the story about how he almost hit a house. And it wasn't a dad joke. They were moving this double wide across the tracks and they were being particularly slow about it, considering a giant freight train was barreling down the tracks at them blowing its horn. About 10 yards out, they finally got all the way across the tracks. My grandfather said he almost shit himself. That's pretty much his weirdest story. My grandpa was a train engineer, and the weirdest story he told me was when he was driving a train somewhere through Alabama and saw a dead body on the side of the tracks. He said the man looked homeless and had severe facial damage and was laying by the tracks covered in blood. He did call the police, but said he heard nothing of what happened after. This will get buried, but my dad works on a train. It was winter with deep snow. Sometimes animals use the tracks as paths. One day, on a passenger train, a possum was walking on the rails. My dad honked his horn, but it wouldn't budge. They stopped the entire train, with over 100 passengers, and the brakeman went out with a broom to scare it away. Suddenly, the possum dropped dead. Eventually, the brakeman had to pick it up by the tail and throw it in the snow. TLDR, possum plays dead on tracks and stops entire train. My dad took photos of the whole ordeal. If there is interest, I'll post them. Train driver from Denmark here. In my experience, the tracks send out a vibe that brings all the people wearing tinfoil hats to us, that or the Danish DMV just won't issue driver's license to bats-hit crazy people. Second engineer on intermodal freight trains between South and West Australia for 4 years. Highly remote part of Australia with extreme temperatures all year round. Most unusual things I have witnessed: 1. Thousands of dead kangaroos. 2. Aboriginal communities living off the grid and naked. 3. Weird flashes of light, multiple colors for the cars dumped on the track, which we have no choice but to hit. 5. Large commercial plane with no decal in a very unusual spot, desert basically, and yes, like others have said, many drunk men passed out near tracks. Not me, weird, or creepy, but I'm telling it anyway. My dad is a retired engineer for Union Pacific. Years ago he saw a coyote feeding on a deer carcass near the tracks. The coyote got startled by the oncoming train and dropped the chunk of meat he had in his mouth. The coyote runs back a few paces when my dad sees a big hawk swoop down and snatch up the chunk of meat and fly away. I work in association with NS, but not for them per se. One day, we get a call saying there was a man trapped in a train car that was locked in there for 2 days. We thought they were kidding until our manager called us to go have a look. We get out there and found out the guy was a hobo from the other side of the state. Some kinds forced him on the train and locked him in. Conductor of passenger rail here. Now that means I don't see nearly as much railroad as engineers, freight conductors, but I've seen enough. There isn't so much as creepy anymore, because a lot of things that happen up there are so common, i.e., hitting people, hitting every type of wildlife ever, and seeing people where you never thought someone would be at 3 a.m. because they like trains. The only thing that still makes me uncomfortable, other than trespasser strikes that are kids or non-suicides, is when it's super foggy out. Now when visibility is limited and you're still going 70 plus into a wall of fog. I have to leave the head end. It's something about the speed and not knowing what's 100 feet ahead of you and having full faith in the signals and equipment. My dad was a special agent, detective. People stealing the signal wire were a big problem. Sometimes they would cut the wrong wire and he'd have to call someone to recover the body. One case he worked, thieves would wait at the base of a mountain for the piggyback train. When it slowed down they would jump on and go to the UPS trailers and just start throwing packages out. Then go by later and pick them up. You'd be surprised at the things shipped UPS, machine guns for example. Conductor here. The railroad I work on is particularly haunted. I've seen a multitude of different shadowy figures in my rail yard. I've even had a ghost pull the cut lever on my train when I was working in industry located next to an abandoned quarry. Tons of ghost stories and legends surrounding the rail industry. My yard office has a ghost of an old yard master in it. We've come into work after it being locked all night to find papers and office supplies thrown all over the room, and the security cameras outside don't show anyone entering or leaving the building. This isn't that unusual. Where I grew up there was a guy known locally as Farmer Bob. Bob was known by the DNR and state troopers, and probably most county sheriffs in the area, as someone who would come and take a fresh deer that was injured or killed by a car. He was on speed dial. This does two things. 1. Cleans the carcass off the road for free, making the officer's life easier and preventing it or other scavengers from becoming a further nuisance. 2. Farmer Bob gets free venison almost year round and shared it with lots of people he knew. It's a win-win for all involved. It's a win-win for all involved. Except the deer. Edit, guys, I meant because he dies, not because he gets eaten. Edit 2, whatever. I wouldn't consider myself lucky if I got hit by a car and then died. But everybody says it's only a matter of time. What a terrible thing to say. Hey, role model 38, what do you do for a living? Oh well, I'm a locomotive engineer. Wow. Have you hit anyone yet? I know. Well, it's only a matter of time, haha, winky face. People within the industry say that. Our trains come in once a week, hitting either a person or animal. During the summer it was a person at least every other week. I know I am not supposed to ask, apparently according to what I have already read in this thread, but my imagination isn't conjuring up anything that I could possibly consider doing at 2 a.m. near a train. Other than happening to be somewhere at 2 a.m. when a train drives by. I think it's something like how guys who love cars will wrap a latex glove around a cold tailpipe, invert the glove, lubricate, penetrate, and then rock the car until release. I think he's talking about something like that, but with trains. Depending on where you are working, becoming an engineer may not take too long. Though it is probably different now. Only took me a year and change before I got into engineer training. Hope when you got trained they told you it was just a matter of time before you hit someone. Took less than 3 years for my incident to happen. This sounds really dubious. Do you have any proof? Edit, from his post history, this guy is a 19-year-old student at Ohio State who recently switched his major from psychology to computer engineering. How interesting that he's already a railroad engineer as well. What a talented young man. NZ here. We've hit school chairs, trolleys, etc. Our nearest major incident was when my LE saw a kid dragging a manhole cover onto the tracks. Called TC for an all-train stop. It's not funny, a manhole cover could easily take a train off the tracks, and this was on a bridge over water. I feel like that kid started with a penny and was just upping the ante until he got closure on what round metal object would derail a train. The whispering is probably easy enough to explain. Human brains are great at pattern matching or recognition. If there's enough low-level random background noise from echoes and such, our delicious brains will try to form it into something recognizable, kinda like people seeing Jesus in toast. So never worry your tasty brain in deserted tunnels about it. It's definitely not zombies. Reminds me of that young train hopping kid they did a documentary on. He said some of the people were scary. He and the journalist became friendly after a while, and suddenly the kid no longer answered calls or updated his Facebook. Still have my fingers crossed for him though, despite the most likely scenario. It's a win-win for all involved. Except the deer. Edit, guys, I meant because he dies, not because he gets eaten. Edit 2, whatever. I wouldn't consider myself lucky if I got hit by a car and then died. Train derails by hitting truck. Dad hears about it and is on way to check it out. While on his way, sees man in the middle of the woods. Continues on to the crash site. Once there, notices that the person in the truck, who's dead, looks just like the person he had just met a little while before. Then the dad goes all 3 spooky 5 me and has to sit down. TLDR, crash train into truck. Guy got out of train and saw a perfectly fine man walking into the woods. Train man checks out guy inside truck. Same guy, except now look in bad shape and somehow teleported. The way I read it is that Arp's dad sees a dude walking away from a train crash. Arp's dad then goes to the scene of the crash and finds a dead dude in the driver's seat of the car who looks almost identical to the person who was walking away from the scene. No, the train's presence on the tracks activate the crossing gates. Depending on speed, they will lower sooner or later and stay up if the train stops far enough from the crossing. Train too close and stopped, gates stay down and piss off everyone. The naked guy would come out onto his porch when he heard the whistles. Have to whistle a cadence when approaching a crossing to warn people regardless of crossing gates being there or not. In rural areas, not all crossings are required to have gates. One of the areas we run though has some industries that are built right up next to the tracks. One of the industries hired some contractors to put up a chain link fence to separate their parking lot from the slum directly across the tracks. The men had about 30 yards of fence put up and were letting the rest of the fencing they were in the process of installing hang loosely toward the ground. As the train went by, one of the grab irons must have snagged the fencing and dragged it along. This worked like a net, sweeping the men up and rolling them along until the end of the fencing they had already installed snapped off. Okay, the way I read it was that your friend personally rolled up a few guys in chain link fence and left them out on the track. I knew I was fucking up somewhere, lol. We reported it to the dispatcher at the time and had to make a statement to the trainmaster at the next terminal. Other than that, we never really heard much more about it. I'm sure there is probably a Railview video of it somewhere out there. We were probably traveling around 45 to 50 miles per hour at the time. A lot of the landscaping stones didn't even make it under the plow on the front of the engine. They just kind of exploded as we hit them and were thrown at very high speed to the side. Those trailer park guys were lucky they didn't get killed. I've worked as a firefighter EMT for 4 years, and the arrogance of some people is astounding. I've had people flip off the fire truck, I've had people intentionally cut off the fire trucks, including a news vehicle which was going to the same plane crash as us, and it always seems to culminate when something bad is actually happening. Bigger issue is people fail to realize that fire trucks are the heaviest vehicles on the roadways in comparison of their size. 2,500 gallons of water, a massive pump, aerial ladders, and a half of ton of cribbing and extraction gear, and you think we can just stop or pull into normal locations. 2,500 gallons of water, that's an added 20,825 pounds, 9,446 kilograms, in water weight alone, in case anyone was wondering. To be fair, if I were a train engineer, that would brighten up my day. Just the thought of a group of hairy obese men hanging out when one turns to the rest and says, "Hey, you know what we should do?" Nah, only one for me. I haven't worked for the railroad for a while now. No, I didn't quit due to killing someone. Though I am sure it didn't help me want to stick it out. While the job isn't bad, the pay can be great, there are still some negatives like missing out on a lot of family-friend things. Very hard to plan anything when you are on call. It was so bad if I figured my phone was going to ring in a certain window, I would just take my gear with me to the movies or dinner just so I could go out. I'm not an engineer or a conductor or anything having to do with trains whatsoever. That said, I have ridden on trains once or twice. One of those times was pretty awesome. Great train, great scenery, great time. At least until I got motion sick. Then I ceased having a good time. Other than that, though, nothing weird happened. Or being ever so gently woken up by the ear-splitting scream of its horn as it passes your house. There's a train about 2 miles from my house that I can hear loud and clear at 2 in the morning when it honks its horn, if that's the right terminology. I don't even want to think about how loud it is for those who live right next to the track. He's talking about things like stomach acids and intestinal juice getting into the meat. You have to clean the animal immediately and very carefully if this happens, and you're still going to have to throw a lot of it out. Yeah, my fiancée actually graduated from UH. I still say that to her, so we can laugh cause she is way smarter than I am. I was always jealous anyway. The UH student body was so much more attractive. If he was out of his car taking pictures, should have chewed all the way into his car. Not fast enough to risk derailment, but enough to leave a definite train was here imprint. Who's gonna side with the nut job who deliberately parked his car on a train track? Knew a military firefighter who used his water truck to knock down a tree that was about to ignite a whole forest. Of course, there was damage to the truck, and his higher-ups were really pissed. The higher-ups didn't really give a shit about forests, as long as they got put out eventually, so. Said friend eventually transferred out to a different operation where they weren't so worried about banging up the equipment. EOD spec ordnance. LOL. Somehow he survived that, and a tour in Iraq. Now he's happy to be back in the States, and not having people fire RPGs at his ride. Guess he finally got his fill of excitement. Laughing face. Please consider subscribing if you enjoyed. Love.